Looking at your preference values might feel like a horoscope reading your mind. When you see them, you might think, wow, this is exactly how I feel about these criteria. How did you know? Well, 1000 Minds knew your preferences because of the trade-offs you made, which is what established your preference values. On the preference values page, we can examine in more detail how important each of our criteria is to us by looking at a series of graphs and charts that break down the preference values of our criteria and their levels in a variety of different ways. The first table shows the preference values of each criterion and the degree of performance of each category in the criterion. The preference value of the highest category represents the relative importance of that criterion. So, for example, great weather has a preference value of 40%, and that number also represents the relative importance of the weather criterion as a whole. The numbers in bold will sum up to a total of 100%, which allows you to interpret the preference values of your criteria in relative terms. For example, the weather is roughly twice as important to us as the nightlife. Our ideal alternative, if it existed, would have the highest level in each of these categories, which, when you sum together the bolded numbers, gives it a total score of 100%. That is your highest ranked possible alternative, which you can view under all possible alternatives. The lowest ranked possible alternative, on the other hand, would be the one that has the lowest level in each of the criteria, giving it a total score of 0%. Below the chart, we find the accuracy of our preference values. Usually, if you've completed all trade-offs involving two criteria, you can be reasonably confident in your alternative rankings. But if you would like to increase the accuracy of your preference values and alternative scores, you can continue to make more trade-offs, this time involving more than two criteria at a time. You can view the possible range of your preference values by toggling the Show Possible Range button above the chart. To view different visualizations of the preference values of our criteria, let's go to the Criteria tab. Here we see a donut chart displaying the relative importance of our criteria as percentages of a whole. We can switch between different graphs on the right-hand side, which all display the same information but in different ways. We can even toggle between two different color palettes as well. Once you found a chart style that you particularly like, you can download it by clicking the Export button. If we scroll down, we find a table which gives us the ratios of the preference values of our criteria relative to each other. So now we know that the weather is 1.8 times as important to us as public transportation, or alternatively, public transportation is 0.6 times as important to us as weather. To get a clearer view of the preference values of the individual levels, let's go to the Levels tab. Just like on the Criteria page, we have the option of toggling between different graphs that each display the level weights in different ways. And we can change the color palette and download the chart we like best. Lastly, on the Marginal Effects tab, we can find a line graph that shows how the preference values of each of our criteria increase by category. Of particular interest is the curvature of each line. Is it linear, or is the slope increasing or decreasing? This tells us how much the preference value would increase by moving to higher categories on a criterion. You can view exact percentages by hovering over any point in the graph. If there are any additional analyses we want to run on the raw data, we can export our preference values by clicking on the Export tab in the right-hand menu, selecting Criteria, and clicking Export.